When Mila is in harmony with nature in the forest, enjoying the tranquility of hunting, does she realize her impending fate as a lycan sacrifice? And when faced with King Alpha Roman Stone's challenge, can she use her mysterious connection with animals to survive? Explore the secrets of the wolf moon. Subscribe to join the adventure. Chapter 1. I slipped through the trees quietly, nearly breathless. The sun had yet to rise, but the tendrils of its slow fingertips lightened the sky sweetly. The January air was crisp and sharp in my lungs, but I didn't feel the cold of the winter. My feet skated over the familiar wooded area, listening to what life remained around me in the quiet morning. I planted my back against the body of a tree, reaching for my weapon with ease. I equipped my bow carefully, a thin arrow just barely between my fingertips as I prepared myself. I sat quietly, listening to the cool air travel through the barren trees lazily. Just in the distance, something shuffled timidly yet too clumsy for its own good. I strung my bow and twisted around the tree lively. My sight aimed at the creature, a young deer wandering silently for food. Its tail lifted and lowered, as it stepped hesitantly over the floor of the woods. Deer were known for being suspicious and paranoid, yet almost gracefully clueless at the same time. I was fond of them. Though if I were honest, I was fond of nature and wildlife in general. With a slow intake of a breath, I settled my aim on the deer and prepared to cause the least amount of pain possible. It lifted its head briefly, glancing around it as though it sensed me. I remained frozen in my position, blending in with my surroundings effortlessly. When it deemed itself momentarily safe, I began to release my arrow. Mila. I winced at how close the cry was to my position. The deer, on the other hand, wasted no time. It kicked off, attempting an escape in a panic. I twisted around the tree, following it with my aim just as quickly before releasing the string of my bow with deadly precision. Without waiting, I bolted from my spot, putting away my bow to withdraw a large knife from the strap of my leg. I reached the deer to find it lying on the floor of the woods, kicking and struggling for what life remained. My aim hadn't been as true as intended. "Shhhh, don't move," I whispered as I lowered myself to it carefully, lightly running my hand over its head with pity. The deer seemed to take my suggestion to heart. It fell silent, no longer struggling against the pain I caused. I had something of a connection to the animals. Sometimes, it was as though they could listen to me. "I'm sorry," I whispered solemnly before drawing my knife over its throat swiftly. "Mila, are you out here?" My brother called out determinedly closer. I cleaned my blade before putting it back in its sheath attached to my leg. I began untwisting straps that I'd used to drag the body back to the village and frowned as my brother walked into visual distance. Greg was 7 years younger than me, and despite being related, we looked nothing alike at the time, except for the eyes. He was thin and gangly, lacking muscle tone, even though he worked quite a lot with my dad on hard labor chores throughout the village. His hair was ginger, which looked funny with his excessive freckles. He took after my mother in that area, scorned by the sunlight and pale as a result. I turned out more athletic and curvy than my more petite mother. My hair was black like coal, which shined blue under moonlight. It stuck out between my family members, being than most were either redheads or brunettes. But all doubt of heritage was smothered by the young family eyes, a jealous green of emerald fire. My father, brother, and I all shared the trait. My mother, on the other hand, held amber copper, which darkened in the night to sable. When I properly strapped the deer, I stood to gain Greg's attention. "I was calling you," he groaned with irritation, glaring at a nearby bush that caught a hold of his sleeve stubbornly. I smiled as he stormed moodily towards me. He would be turning 11 soon, and already he showed signs of that teenage doom and gloom. I liked him despite his annoyances. "I was hunting," I told him, "and you almost cost me game, by the way." "You never lose the game," he muttered, disbelieving. I began walking back towards home, and he followed beside me silently. After a moment, I glanced at him curiously. "Why were you looking for me?" "Dad told me to get you." He seemed really bothered, more so than usual. When he stopped moving forward, I paused as well. "What is it?" "We should go camping for a few days." "Like how you do sometimes," Greg suggested. I laughed. "You hate camping outside." "Maybe I've changed my mind," he muttered unhappily. I looked at him carefully, having already guessed what was bothering him. January was the month of the wolf moon. Every year the human villagers were required to give up a sacrifice to the lycans for the hunt. Our particular village was one of the largest of the human habitats, so the chance of being sacrificed seemed slim. It was more likely to be killed at random by a wandering werewolf when hunting, as I tended to do. At least until last year, when one of Greg's best friends was selected. The entire process was eerie. The King Alpha of the lycans issued the requirements of the sacrifice each year, sometimes demanding young adult men, or the elderly. Last year included children between the age of 5 to 10 years old. I had never felt such raw fear as then, and so this year I could understand Greg's discomfort. The King Alpha demanded young female virgins between 13 to 18. I was snuggled in the center of the requirement. It wasn't as if I announced I was a virgin. In fact, I considered lying, but those trying to evade the process would risk the life of everyone they knew if they were caught. So I admitted my potential and now waited for appointed lycans that would arrive to each village on the day of the wolf moon. That day happened to be today. "I'll be fine," I told Greg, reaching to mess up his hair before pausing. Blood still dirted my hand from the deer. Instead, I bumped into him teasingly. "Come on. If Dad is calling for me, that means the lycans are here." When I walked into the house, it was into a world of chaos. My mother was hysterical with panic, similar to last year, when she had to present Greg to the wolves. I could still hear her cry of sheer relief and terror when he came back untouched but in tears. "Milena, where were you?" she screeched in fear. I dropped the deer in bewilderment. My close family were all buzzing around the room in equal panic. My aunt immediately began to pull off my clothes while my cousin simultaneously began tugging the presentation dress over my head. "There's no time for a bath, darling. The other potentials are already there." My aunt cooed to me as soothingly as possible, picking at the remains of the woods in my wild hair. My initial shock was turning into real fear. "I'm late?" I asked. "We sent Greg for you hours ago." My cousin stressed with anxiety. I stepped into the shoes placed in front of me, but it did me no good. I looked wrecked. A glance around revealed a guilty-appearing Greg, who no doubt had tried to postpone my return to avoid having to present me. My mother was beside herself now that I was here, wailing with fear. My father was comforting her the best he could, but he looked terrified himself. "There's just no time, Milena. Go on. Get there as fast as your feet will take you," my aunt instructed me, her voice strained. Before I could turn to obey, she grasped my face in her hands quickly. "Step lightly, my child. Remain unseen," I breathed, repeating what had been lectured to me since the requirements had been announced. She released me and I immediately ran back into the cold air of the January morning. My feet were less certain as I raced to the presentation. The sky was suddenly too bright and everyone was waking. People I both knew and didn't know were looking through windows and standing in doorways, watching as I ran past. I felt my feet were heavy, not light. I felt extremely on display, seen by all. My stomach was tight from dread. I approached the center hall, the townhouse, where the presentation was held every year. There was not a sound nearby besides my breathless gasps as I reached for the door. I hesitated, taking a moment to collect my breath before straightening my shoulders and opening the door. Finally, the village leader John declared as he saw me enter the lobby. He immediately grasped my arm, tugging me almost roughly towards a side door. "You're late and they are extremely impatient people." "I'm sorry," I apologized sincerely, trying not to panic as I was led into the presentation room. A line of girls similar to my age were standing, each with an expression of fear as we entered. Most were relieved when they saw it was just me, but many others seemed to be stuck in that constant terrorized state. "Stand with them." "I'll be right back," John announced, leaving me with the rest swiftly. I quickly shuffled to the end of the line, glancing at the others despite not wanting to. I didn't want to see the face of the one chosen. I would be haunted enough as is. However, as I stood waiting, I noticed that each girl was clean, spotless. Their hair was styled meticulously. Their presentation outfits were without a wrinkle, stain, or tear. Their skin was untouched by the outside world, if only for the moment. I hesitated and looked down at myself. My hair was untamed and still held evidence of my hunt and the woods. My dress was tattered from the run here. My hands were tainted by the blood of my game. Much of the blood remained along the back of my legs from dragging the corpse. I smelled of the trees, wildlife, and nature in general. I stuck out horribly. Step lightly. Remain unseen. I swallowed loudly and nearly felt nauseated when the door opened again loudly. The others whimpered beside me, just as terrified to be there as anyone else. I stared at the two forms that followed behind the village leader, never having laid eyes on the deity shapeshifters before. My fear was overwhelming, but at the same time, I was horribly curious and dazed at being before such creatures. One stood off to the side, obvious respect radiating towards the other, as he allowed him to take lead. The leading lycan was a looming figure, powerful in just his existence. I felt I could look at him for hours and not be able to take in more than a couple of his features. His appearance was that shocking. He was radiating energy, as he stepped in front of us without actually looking at us. His hair was either light brown or dark blonde and was short, but otherwise uncared for. He was horribly scarred on every part of him that I could see bared, which wasn't much. His face held marks of animal attacks, claws and teeth alike, but despite the apparent scars he was striking and godlike. "My name is King Alpha Roman Stone," he announced sharply, his voice a growl of distaste as he addressed us with a glance over us as a whole, as though he couldn't actually see the potential victims. I would have been stunned by his introduction. After all, the King Alpha was considered the highest on the lycan rulership, and in the same way the highest ruler over the human cattle. But my current level of panic was too high to surpass any further. I felt downright numb. "As you know, I'm here to select the sacrifice. Every village offers one to each pack, and you will be selected for the Trinity pack." The King Alpha stopped momentarily before announcing what he deemed obvious: my pack. He turned to glance at John. "This is all of them, right? Or should we just spend some time picking off members of your community until you're ready?" His tone was so dark and nasty enough as it was, but the idea that my tardiness could have caused horrible consequences made me redden deeply with shame. "This is everyone," John assured. "I apologize profusely, King Alpha. You can take 2 if you must." "I can take all of them if I must," the King Alpha snarled back dangerously, causing many of the girls to gasp with terror. He turned back to us, towering and horrifying, but seemed to calm back to boredom just as quickly. "One will do. Let's start." The King Alpha took a step forward, finally doing more than glancing over each of us. I considered taking the time to wipe the blood from my hand onto my dress, but then feared staining the fabric even further. Instead, I tightened my hands into fist firmly, looking down at the ground in front of me with anxiety. I was startled when large feet planted in front of me. Had he really gone through each so quickly? Did he pick already? Or don't they go over each potential before picking? I thought I heard him say something. What did he say? Why didn't I listen? The silence was deadly. I hesitated. I looked from the feet to the bodies next to me, trying to look anywhere but at the King Alpha. The girls all looked pale and terrified, but they were all staring at me now. Apparently, they had been listening. I asked you a question, the King Alpha growled lowly. I winced, turning my head slowly towards him. My eyes trained on his chest in front of me, his arms crossed and waiting. No? I chanced questioningly, hoping the answer would be correct. So you weren't the one who forced me to wait for over an hour? He asked. No, he repeated. I reddened again, but lifted my eyes from his chest to his face daringly. My eyes were greeted with his cold, blue glare. No, I repeated firmly. And before I could stop myself, I added in perhaps the most polite, but sarcastically seasoned way, I would not dare presume a human like myself could force any lycan to do anything at all. The following silence was probably even deadlier than the previous. I had never felt a regret so instant as this one. I nearly yelped when the King Alpha stepped forward, reaching for my face dominatingly. I held my breath, as he twisted my face side to side briefly before grasping my wrist firmly. What's your name, human? He demanded more than asked. Mila Young. I winced when he bent forward, breathing in my scent with a low growl. He pulled my wrist to his mouth, running his tongue over the blood remaining on my flesh dangerously. The sight was terrifying enough to drop my stomach to the floor. When he twisted my wrist, trailing his tongue towards the bottom of my hand, he paused to look at the small birthmark on the flesh of my palm, just under my pinky. To me, it looked like a smile or the tip of a fingernail. To others, it looked like a crescent moon. Are you a hunter, Milena? The King Alpha asked me cryptically. I could barely manage a response, yes. So am I. He released me promptly, as though the moments spent observing me were something disgusting to him. He turned to John before indicating to his fellow lycan, we'll take this one. Let's go. The first thing I heard was the gasps of relief from the surrounding girls within the room. I saw them embrace one another, their joy was that great. The next thing I heard was something of a choked sound escaping my own throat. I felt my eyes were too wide and my limbs too stiff suddenly. WW-. The lycan accompanying the King Alpha approached me and yanked me forward, twisting me in front of him before pushing my head forward and down as though wanting me to bow. Then he grabbed my hands and pulled them behind me, tying them together painfully. I remained silent momentarily, the reality of the situation not having found me as of yet. When the lycan finished, he pushed me forward towards the door. What? I asked, stuck on the initial comment, we'll take this one. The King Alpha went ahead of us and the lycan pushed me to follow him. I turned to look at my peers with sheer panic. Wait, what? Me? I began to struggle and the lycan merely shoved me forward with ease. When I refused to take my steps forward, he resolved to drag me out by the elbow. I tried to sputter more words, but instead began gasping for air as though I were being suffocated. When we stepped outside, a crowd had evolved. Families of the potential were gathered, waiting to see who had been chosen and who had been freed. As I stepped into the sunlight, a horrific wail lifted through the air. I found my family immediately, my mother screaming with realization. More wails followed, the cries of people who knew me, who had watched me grow among them, and would now watch me taken away forever. I was forced to follow the King Alpha even though I immediately struggled to run to my family. Before we could make it through the crowd, a louder mass of cries evolved. I looked towards my family in bewilderment, as my younger brother ducked under my dad's arm and ran towards me with something in his hand. Immediately, the whole of my family and friends ran after him. The lycan containing me stiffened, preparing for a fight. The King Alpha snarled furiously, stepping forward to greet the group of humans who dared approach him. His eyes didn't register Greg, who had been overtaken by the group, and for that I was grateful. However, I was terrified for my family's life. No! Don't hurt them! I cried out, trying to rip my arms from the lycan's grip. The group collided with the King Alpha, and I closed my eyes, as he easily swiped them away furiously. The lycan released me momentarily, aiming to help his king. I spotted Greg and ran to him, bending down to him. "Gregory! I brought you this," he gasped, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. He lifted the sheath and blade I had previously had wrapped around my leg for my hunt. I looked at it to him, considering how absurd he was. "Are you crazy? Maybe you can fight them off," he pleaded, the only hope in his mind being the thing in his hands. I hesitated, but I didn't want to see that look of despair on his face any longer. I stood and stepped my foot forward. "You'll have to put it on," I told him. "Hurry." He reached under my dress and tied the strap around my leg as quick as his clumsy hands would allow. Just as he finished tightening the strap properly, I was yanked away painfully. I yelped and Greg aimed to tackle the lycan capturing me. My aunt caught him, pulling him away the opposite direction. "Fight them, Mila!" he cried out. "Don't let them kill you. Promise me. Promise me." I was ripped away, a cloth suddenly wrapped around my eyes to blind me from my surroundings. As I was taken from my village, all I could hear were cries of pain and despair, and among it all was my younger brother's voice fading away, but still demanding over and over again for my life. "I promise," I whispered to myself faintly. Chapter 2. With my sight taken from me and hands tied behind me, there was no chance of finding calm or peace in my time of terror and ultimate doom. I breathed heavily, my wrists aching from trying to get out of my bindings. I blindly shifted my head side to side occasionally, as though I could catch a glimpse of my surroundings. My only relief was the feel of my blade resting against the strap around my leg, hidden under my dress. My fear was that during this wolf moon hunt, I would be hunted with my hands tied and blinded. When we arrived, or so I assumed, I was pushed across a tricky surface, which aimed to catch my feet on rocks and roots. I fell 2 times before strong arms lifted me from the ground and slung me none too gently over their shoulder. The position wasn't comfortable, but I could only manage small, fearful cries in response. I considered ways to plead for my life, but knew already it was pointless. These were creatures of godlike magnitude. They were worshipped, feared, but considered deities. Being chosen as a sacrifice was something like an honor, though a painful and forced one. And all sacrifices never came back. Never. Werewolves weren't merciful creatures. I yelped as I was dropped roughly onto the ground. I immediately tried to straighten myself, keeping my knife covered and reaching for the ground with my hands to try to discern where I was. The floor was stone, so I was inside somewhere. When I shuffled away, my back hit a wall solidly. "She smells wild," a female voice stated without emotion. "Apparently, she pissed off Alpha Roman," a man responded simply. "They put up a fight this time, though. Had to drop a few humans before leaving. At least she's not a crier." "Those are so annoying," the woman stated, but I was still stuck on the previous statement. Drop a few humans. Did he mean someone died in the attack? It was something I should have expected, considering how lowly lycans thought of us, but the pain of knowing some of my family and friends were now dead because of me caused sudden and immense grief. I tightened my thighs together and frowned deeply, but I didn't allow the tears to fall from my eyes. When there was no more talking, I hesitated. I waited, listening for any sounds of lycans nearby. Not even the sound of shuffling feet came to me. I immediately began scooting along the wall behind me, feeling the texture and the floor for any protruding objects. After touching along the corner of the wall, my hand pricked against something, causing me to wince at the sudden pain of a minor cut. I flexed my hands apart as much as I could and began scraping it against the sharp object repeatedly. I did this for the longest time. Every noise made me stop in fear of being caught. When the fabric finally tore away, I had to restrain myself from crying out with momentary joy. I immediately reached for the cloth blinding me and pulled it from my face. My eyes took a moment to adjust, taking in the sight of a small and worn detainment cell. There were no windows and only a single, barred door. I had no idea of determining what time it was, but it had to be well into the day if not nearly the evening by now. And once the sun rested on the horizon, the wolf moon would shine and the hunt would commence. I skated along the walls of my cell, touching every inch of it as though I could find some sort of crack and manage to escape through it. Only after I tried unlocking or breaking the door, and attempting to dig through the floor, did I finally crawl to the corner of the cell and resolve to the initial idea of fighting to the death. I stayed perched in the corner, crouching in preparation for a quick attack. My hand had the fabric of my dress raised and was rested over the hilt of my knife determinedly. When it felt like days had passed, the sound of footsteps finally greeted me. I tightened my grip on the hilt, my breath coming short in panic. The wolf appeared at the door with ease. It was the same lycan that had accompanied the King Alpha to my village. He assessed my position with serious eyes before finally opening my cell determinedly. The fact that he could see I was preparing for some sort of attack, but didn't seem concerned told me what little he thought of my abilities. And apparently he was right. I lunged and was immediately thrown against the wall. I was too dazed to even cry out, having felt the impact of the wall against my rather human fragile skull. Instead, I turned into wet spaghetti against the lycan, who held me pinned against the wall easily. "You should have saved your strength for the hunt," the lycan informed me, "now you'll have a headache on top of everything else." He ran his hand under my dress, where he had seen me resting my own before. I hadn't even been able to withdraw my knife from its holster. The lycan paused when his touch found it hidden. "Sneaky girl," he exclaimed with amusement before laughing and releasing his grip on the weapon. "I won't tell if you don't. Maybe it'll make things more interesting. Come on, then." I was roughly pulled from the wall and shoved from the cell. I struggled to keep up with the pace the lycan demanded of me, my head still throbbing and my vision only just beginning to come into full focus. We stepped outside and I was only able to glance at the horizon of buildings, a far more intricate and well-off village than my own, before I was turned the opposite direction, and into the woods. My heart raced painfully in my chest with each step I was forced to take. Being able to see didn't help my fear at all. In fact, I began to see people. Werewolves. They stood in human form, just a few at first. But the further we walked, the more there appeared to be. All of them were either my age or older. I wasn't sure how I would have felt about children hunting me as well. There were hundreds of them. At some point, I couldn't see what the fun even was in hunting a single human on one full moon. Only one or a few could enjoy the kill, the rest would just be witnesses, or just be in the same vicinity. What was the point besides senseless murder? I was shoved through the pack and in front of the entire crowd was a single man, who stood looking up at the sky watching the moon with a look of intense hatred across his features. I suspected wolves revered the moon, considering it something with a deep connection to their culture. It was strange to see such a look on a deity shapeshifter when looking to that bright orb. King Alpha Roman Stone, as he called himself, turned his steel-blue eyes from the sky and found me within his sights. I stared at him, my eyes wide with terror, but again finding something curious and amazing in seeing the silhouette of such a powerful creature standing in the light of the moon. Centuries ago, humans broke the peace with the wolf packs by slaughtering our innocents in the thousands. Tonight, we hunt yet another just as they hunted us. We spill the blood of another human, not for the honor our moon goddesses. We spill this blood in spite of them. We do it for us, for the lycanthropes in our pack and all packs alike. There were cries of agreement, loud and hungry for a taste of my blood. I trembled fearfully, looking around at the faces of these creatures as they prepared for their hunt. When strong, forceful hands gripped my upper arms, I gasped in terror. I turned to peer at the King Alpha, expecting to be ripped apart right then. Run, human. Feel the fear you tried to force on us. Feel the impending doom our mothers felt when your men tore down their doors with horrific weapons. And then feel the pain of their deaths and know nothing you do will save you or your kind, the King Alpha growled, his words thick with historic anger, as if he had been there all those centuries ago himself. He turned me, facing me towards the woods where no wolf stood in my way. And then he released me. I stood frozen, stuck in a moment where time paused and not a breath could be heard. Then I ran. I breathed loudly, nearly hyperventilating, as I bolted through the trees in sheer panic. I did this for only a moment before I tripped over a jutted root, landing roughly on the floor of the forest. I pushed myself up, leaning against the adjacent tree and taking a moment to breathe deeply. While I tried to gain control of my breath, I thought about my little brother. I touched the outline of the knife on my leg, recalling my promise to him and to myself. I pushed myself back onto my feet, running through the trees with renewed vigor. I didn't have to be so blind while running. I spent much of my time in woods similar to this. My skin was still tainted from my previous hunt. I didn't have to act as though my surrounding was so unfamiliar. I began to erupt short, sharp whistles followed by clicking my tongue as I slowed my running. I paused after a couple tries, looking around for tracks or evidence of wildlife. I reached out with that part of my soul that connected with that wildlife, that was so fond of the forest and its creatures. 2 rabbits emerged from their hiding spots and I quickly flattened myself against a tree, hearing a howl in the distance. My heart rate spiked, suspecting this meant they would be coming after me. "Come here, little ones," I whispered as I approached the rabbits. They were antsy, but they held still as I knelt beside them. I pulled my knife from its sheath and pushed it against my hand, hesitating to look at that crescent birthmark on my palm of my left hand. I then forced myself to slice the blade across my hand, wincing at the angry pain that resulted. I grabbed the first rabbit, rubbing my blood on its paws and parts of its fur at random. I did the same with the other before releasing them. I hissed to them, "Run!" And as though they could understand me, they ran in 2 different directions. I used my blade to rip off a piece of my dress, wrapping the fabric around my hand. Then, I began to run again as well. I could hear the howls coming closer and closer, but it seemed to me they were spreading out and not as focused on me as would be expected. I kept running, my stamina keeping up with my legs. I leapt over a log, turned a corner, and suddenly found myself in the audience of a large, black wolf. Its fur was impossibly dark, like a shadow in the night. However, its eyes were a sapphire blue, bright and near illuminating as it peered at me. I expected to fight it, the knife ready in my hand, but there was something about it that made me feel as though I weren't in danger of it. At least, I thought so. The wolf suddenly looked into the moon and howled, long and loud. More howls followed, alerted to my position. I immediately turned and ran, believing the wolf would follow the call with an attack. However, a glance back revealed the wolf standing where I had left it, watching me go silently. I didn't stop. Just because one wolf didn't attack didn't mean another wouldn't. And this was proven when I was crossing a small stream, and was suddenly knocked down viciously. The knife dropped from my hand as I hit the ground. Claws immediately swiped at me, slicing across my stomach painfully. I screamed loudly, no doubt alerting even more wolves, but then forced myself to roll away and reached for my knife. I looked up, spotting the grey wolf standing just feet away with bared teeth and blooded claws. I only had enough time to take a single breath before it lunged for me. I immediately dove backwards, gripping my knife with 2 hands and shoving it forward. The blade sunk into the wolf's neck. If it were a tiny blade, it might have been useless, but it seemed just big enough to cause damage. The wolf yelped horribly, rolling away from me and taking me with it. I ripped the knife from its throat and instead aimed for the eye, thrusting the blade into the socket deep enough to hit brain even through that abnormally large wolf head. I tore the knife away and stabbed the wolf again, blood spilling over me thickly. It seized under me familiarly, the death throes of an animal, something I had become accustomed to in my experience as a hunter. However, when the wolf began to shift under me and took the form of a middle-aged woman, a wave of illness rushed over me. I reached for the knife planted in her eye and found it was embedded into her skull, no doubt from the shift change. I struggled with it for a moment and cried out in disgust and frustration. When wolves howled nearby, I winced and opted to try running for it again. As I ran, leaving behind the dead lycan and my weapon, I found my strength beginning to wane significantly. I held my hand and arm over my stomach, feeling the agony and wet damage of the lycan's claws. I made it only a short distance before I stumbled and then stopped. In the distance, wolves were waiting as though they knew I was coming long ago. I turned sharply and more wolves were coming into view. I was surrounded. Coat after coat of wolves shifted under the moonlight, knowing I was caught. It was the end of the hunt. I thought about my family back home. I thought of my little brother, so reluctant to let me go. I thought of my dad, strong and protective, as he taught me to string a bow with ease. I thought of my mom and all her smiles, now smothered by those terrible wails of despair, as her only daughter was sacrificed to the wolf moon. I looked from the wolves to the moon, my hands falling away from my wounded stomach. Then, as if moved by something other than myself, I lifted my left hand to the moon. I offered that wounded hand, blooded from death all in a single day. Mother, I cried out pitifully with tears in my eyes, calling to a woman I know couldn't save me. However, as the word left my lips, another image flashed behind my eyes. Another woman, familiar like my mother, offering me comfort, a goddess reflected in the moonlight. I felt an urge pulse throughout me. Just as the wolves surrounding me howled and attacked, diving towards my battered form, I fell to the floor of the forest onto my knees roughly. I slammed my offered hand to the ground and a burst of power rippled around me, clawing through the wolves simultaneously. Stop! I cried out, reaching towards them all with that power in anguish. For a moment, there was dead silence. When I didn't feel the pain of teeth and claws ripping into me, I lifted my head from the ground slowly. Dozens of wolves stood just steps away from me, paused in mid-step and panting loudly. I could feel the breath of those closer, frozen under my order. I hesitated, keeping my hand clenched into a fist with confusion. I recalled my connection with the wildlife, how they could hear me sometimes and did as I asked. The pain of my wound was throbbing, but I was afraid of staying where I was. Stay back, I ordered, igniting some dangerous growls from many of the wolves. Some shuffled their feet in place, trying to step forward, but finding it difficult. When one made a step, I cried out, "Stop! Back away!" The wolves whimpered, stepping back as I asked. More wolves appeared in the distance, but just as each stepped into range it was as though they were caught in a web. They froze where they stood, some huffing with confusion. I tried to move from my knees to my feet, but cried out when the pain intensified and I ended up on the ground again. I panted, focusing on the wolves around me determinedly. I knew if I didn't focus, they would attack again. However, I couldn't stay here. I clenched my hand over my stomach again, ignoring the blood now dripping dangerously over my legs. I winced and whimpered as I stood, staggering as I caught my footing. Just as I did, another wolf joined the circle of what had grown to at least 100 and continued to increase. I could feel whatever was happening was becoming strained under the sheer amount of wolves surrounding me. The larger wolf stepped through the frozen wolves, huffing and growling angrily. I focused on it, holding out my injured hand. "Stop!" I demanded desperately, don't move." The wolf slowed impossibly, struggling against my order. I could feel that connection reach for him, twisting through his stubborn mind and demanding that he listen to my words. The amount of focus I needed was extreme, and somehow I knew this wolf was the King Alpha. He remained frozen for a moment, catching the attention of the other wolves. When he didn't approach further, their heads turned to me and back again. I watched as the wolves stepped away, many leaning forward to bare the back of their necks towards me. It was as if they were offering themselves for me to hunt rather than the reverse. The King Alpha snarled angrily, pushing against my demand furiously. His fur was a blend of dark brown and red, flashing under the moonlight, and trading colors easily with every breath. Even as a wolf, I could see signs of battle and scars through his coat. He was terrifying. He took a step forward, breaking through just momentarily. "Don't come closer," I ordered, my voice trembling from weakness. I pushed against him with that demand, the power flaring within me again. The wolves surrounding me sniffed the air, some whimpering and huffing in a way I couldn't quite understand. The King Alpha sniffed the air as well, tilting his head. And then he began to shift. His bones reformed, his skin evolving around his form, and he lifted himself until he was on 2 human feet. I felt my will falter, unsure of how to connect to a creature that looked too human to be wildlife. He took another step towards me. "Stop," I demanded weakly, and the connection was there enough to make him hesitate. There was something crossing his features as he took me in, fighting against my order simultaneously. "You smell like wolf," the King Alpha declared, his voice low and angry. "I killed one," I both explained the smell and threatened at the same time. "And you think you can kill me? You think you can take my pack?" I glanced around at all the lycans still in their wolf forms, bowing obediently towards me. Could I take all of them on? I doubted it. I didn't even think I'd get this far. I didn't even know what was going on. When I turned back to the King Alpha, he was significantly closer. "Stay back!" I cried out in fear. The power flared within me once more, lifting whimpers from around me. The King Alpha hesitated again, his eyes skating over me with confusion. He took a deep breath, sniffing the air around me as he hadn't yet gotten any closer. "You smell like my mate." The utter confusion in this statement could do nothing to equal my own. My breath was extremely labored at this point, and the pain in my stomach was unimaginable. He took another step forward, and when I tried to order him back, I found my vision blurred. I breathed the beginning of a curse and fell into a doomed darkness. The only thing that followed was the whisper of that word. Chapter 3. I woke slowly with confusion. I wasn't sure what had happened to me, if I had a nightmare, or if I had actually died. I could feel the fabric of sheets around me, as my eyes tried to adjust to the bright light of the day. Beside me, a hand drew a warm, wet cloth over my forearm carefully. The events of the wolf moon flooded back to me and I gasped, sitting up quickly in panic. I expected immense pain around my abdomen, but instead was greeted with a small ache. "Don't worry. Calm down," a voice appealed to me pleadingly. I looked to my left, finding a woman sitting by my bedside with the wet cloth still in her hand. She looked surprised to see me awake. I looked from her to my body, taking in my appearance. Someone had changed my clothes. I now wore loose pants and a plain white shirt. When I pulled my shirt up, my stomach was wrapped with bandages. My leg was bare of my knife, but then I recalled the weapon had been left in the skull of a she-wolf. I leapt from the bed quickly, inhaling sharply at the cold of the floor against my bare feet. The woman beside my bed stood as well, lifting her hands as if this would prove her to be safe. I knew those hands could shift into deadly claws. "Where am I?" I asked her accusingly, looking around wildly. The room was mostly bare besides a lot of bandages and medicine. It looked too clean. It looked too strange. Like maybe I was going to be split apart by curious werewolves with their dissective knives. "You're in our clinic," the woman said carefully. I peered at her suspiciously. She was frail, looking for a werewolf. She was petite. I would have considered her malnourished if it wasn't for the fact that she looked rather healthy. Her hair was brown and to her shoulders in curls. Her eyes were a darker brown, but soft. The look in them reminded me of my mother. The thought struck me momentarily. This was a vicious lycan. Why am I here? I recalled being in my own village. I recalled my brother running for me, and my mother crying out in hysterics. I could still feel the floor of the forest under me as I ran into the night, the moon high in the sky and the howls deafening. The hunt was called off. "You were brought here," the woman explained softly, moving to the end of the bed slowly. I held my hand out and she stopped, backing away uncertainly. "You were hurt pretty badly. You've been recovering here for a few days now." "I don't feel hurt," I responded with distrust. I touched my stomach again, feeling only the ache of superficial cuts. I remembered the shocking pain that had come with the impact of those claws against my flesh, and the blood that had leaked over my legs. "You've been healing quickly. Maybe not as much as an adult lycan, but a child pre-shift." The insinuation the woman was making was enough to make me stare at her in disbelief. "I'm not a lycan," I told her firmly. "You smell like one," she answered, lowering her head carefully, "sometimes." "I'm not a lycan," I repeated, and then I turned away. I rummaged through a nearby cupboard, quickly picking out something sharp before moving towards the door. "You shouldn't leave. Alpha Roman demanded you stay here," the woman told me, twisting her hands together nervously. I hesitated, hearing his words echoing in my mind. "Mate?" I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't know then, and I didn't care to know now. If it was enough for him to call off the hunt, maybe it just meant there was a mistake. Maybe it meant I could go back home to my family. Or maybe there was something worse waiting for me than a hunt. I couldn't sit here and wait to find out. "Don't follow me," I threatened the waif of a woman, pointing at her with my small pointed sort of knife. She watched me a moment before looking away nervously. I had never felt scary before, but something in the way she refused to look in my eyes made me feel just that. It probably was because I had killed one of them. I still didn't know what to make of that. I bolted from the door, looking both ways before creeping along the wall of the clinic. When I moved around the corner, I caught the attention of another woman who merely looked away and walked the opposite direction. I frowned, tightening my grip on my sharp object. It became apparent after a few meetings with the shapeshifters that they weren't going to try stopping me. In fact, some even arched forward when seeing me, tilting their heads as if baring their necks to me. It was confusing and weird. I ignored them and ran for it. I wasn't sure how to get out of the clinic, but I followed my instincts. I hated buildings like this one. I preferred being outside. I liked having space. It would have been better if there were more windows, but I suspected many of the windows were in the rooms behind doors. And I'd be damned if I purposely walked into a room filled with lycans. I was creeping along the hall towards what looked like a door leading to the outside when it was opened by a large figure coming inside. I recognized the King Alpha immediately and stiffened. He didn't seem to have expected to find me here, but otherwise showed no signs of what he might be thinking. On impulse, I immediately opened the nearest door to me and ran inside, shutting it and attempting to lock it. But of course, the door didn't have a lock. I looked around at another room similar to the one I woke up in. My only relief was that it was empty, but that was the extent of that relief. I ran for the window, opening it swiftly. Just as quickly, two hands were beside mine and easily slammed the window shut. I made a noise of disbelief, twisting around to find myself trapped by the King Alpha. I planted my back against the window, as though I could just teleport through it. "You're awake," he stated, those cold blue eyes taking me in intensely. I tried to find some place to focus on his face, but it was like looking into the sun. It didn't seem right that something so beautiful could exist. I closed my eyes tightly, deciding to just focus on his words. "Nice observation. I can see why they made you the king of alphas," I responded, the sarcasm in my words laced with fear and anxiety. "You're mocking me for pointing out the obvious," he stated once more. I wasn't sure if it was a question, or an accusation. Or just a statement. To become the king of alphas, I started at the bottom. His hand was suddenly on mine, twisting open my fingers until I was forced to drop the small weapon I held in it. Then he stepped even closer to me, lifting my hand to his face carefully. I opened my eyes widely, watching as he breathed deeply, scenting me as he had before when selecting me for the wolf moon hunt. "I killed my way to the top and now I kill anyone who challenges me," he finished simply, turning those eyes from my skin to my face suspiciously. "You don't smell like a wolf or my mate. But during the hunt, you smelled of both." "I'm not a lycan," I repeated, deciding I should probably wear this statement as a sign around my neck. "Do what you did in the forest," he demanded, narrowing his eyes as he watched me expectantly. "I didn't do anything," I answered quickly. "My wolves say you called to the mother and they believe she answered." "Do it again." I stared at him with disbelief. I was suddenly embarrassed. I didn't want to admit what I had really done in that moment. It was admitting that they had actually turned me into a sobbing child calling for her mother in the moment before death. I became frustrated. "Get off of me." I pulled my hand from his grip forcefully and began to shove him with irritation. When he didn't move, I twisted and turned, scampering from under his arms until I was free from his suffocating presence. "You'll learn to do as I tell you to if you wish to remain here," the King Alpha growled dangerously, turning with me to watch me stumble into the center of the room. "I don't want to remain here," I snapped in exasperation. "What am I doing here? I want to go home." He shifted, walking towards me in such an intimidating way. I took a couple of steps back by habit, but didn't look away from those intensely cold eyes. "You're here because I demand it. You're in this clinic because you were injured. I need you to heal fully before we can complete the challenge you issued on my pack and I," he told me, his tone dark and dangerous. My brow furrowed as I stared at him with utter confusion. "Wait, what? A challenge? A challenge? My pack has accepted you as superior to them. After all, you challenged each of them and they submitted. You killed one of us, something I thought impossible with someone of your stature. And you challenged me," he growled angrily, obviously displeased with this thought. "Our battle was interrupted. It's part of our etiquette to allow the challengers to be in full health before completing a challenge. So I'll allow you to heal," and then I remembered his words. He killed those who challenged him. "I don't want to challenge anyone," I exclaimed in panic, raising my hands in rejection. The Alpha shrugged off my words. "It's already done." He was suddenly there, gripping my arms in his hands and pulling me to him. I gasped as he lowered his face into my neck, breathing in deeply. I stiffened under him, holding my own breath, as he searched me, no doubt for that smell of wolf they kept speaking of. "I'm not a lycan," I whimpered, the phrase already too tired from overuse. "How did you control the wolves?" He turned his lips over my neck quite suddenly. The touch of them on the curve into my shoulder sent a spark throughout me. I tensed further, my answer choking under my surprise. I don't know." I struggled to respond. The Alpha growled with frustration, lifting his face from my flesh and twisting me around roughly. I immediately tried to pull out of his grasp, but he was far too strong for me. He began to lead me out of the room, through the hall, and into the outside world. I blinked against the bright light of the sun, struggling as I tried to keep up with the alpha's pace. Lycans paused as we stormed past, each of them bowing either to me or to the alpha. I just wasn't sure anymore. "Where are you taking me?" I asked in panic. "Seeing as you're well enough to run around." "I'm still hurt. I can't do the challenge now," I cried out fearfully. The alpha laughed then, the sound startling and strangely appealing despite the cruelty of this particular laugh. "You're being banished to display until the challenge. It's one of the highest shames of our pack. I'm sure you'll love it," he teased without mercy. I didn't know what exactly he was talking about, so I opted to just continue being stressed because of ignorance. "What does that mean? Banished to display? Shame?" I had an epiphany. "You're going to make me sit on display naked in front of everyone while they poke me with hot iron." "Oh, not that. Not that, please. Not that." "But you are giving me ideas," he answered, pushing me through the door of a separate building. I balked as I was led into what looked like a mess hall. Row upon row of tables were seated with various lycans eating their lunch. It looked strangely human. Eyes lifted from their food as we entered and they quickly looked away, baring necks as I was forced across the large room. In front of all the tables were separate tables, each with chains and shackles seated on top. I counted 6 tables total and the alpha brought me to one of the ones in the center. He turned to face me towards the lycans, presenting me to them. "This she-wolf has challenged me for the pack, but until the challenge is complete. I'm not a she-wolf," I snapped spitefully. "She is still considered a lesser wolf. Are you even listening to me?" The alpha yanked on my arm roughly, causing me to wince. "As such, she will be punished for defying my direct orders." "What orders?" I winced again, when he pulled on my arm for silence again. "For defying my order of staying where she's supposed to be and for trying to escape. She will be sentenced to display abuse until the challenge is complete," the alpha finished. I was pulled onto the table rather roughly and despite my struggles, I was chained to the surface easily. I spent a moment trying to pull myself out of the containment, but found I could only get as far as my knees before being unable to lift myself further. "This is it?" I asked despite trying to keep my mouth shut. The alpha planted his hands on the table in front of me, staring me down dangerously. I watched him with wide eyes, my skin heated by his full attention. "They can throw food at you if they want to," he finally said to me simply. I narrowed my eyes suddenly, a flame of anger beginning to heat within me. "Good. I'm hungry," I responded sharply. Don't miss Mila's next hunting moment. Subscribe to stay updated.